Zelda dungeons suck. Well, sometimes. It should come as no surprise that dungeons are one of, if not the most beloved aspects of the Legend of Zelda games. Despite nearly every single Zelda game having an extremely stacked roster of dungeons, there are some dungeons that stain an otherwise perfect catalog. I have spent a lot of time on my channel talking about the greatness of the Legend of Zelda's many temples, but with all that positivity, there is just as much negativity on the same topic. In this video, I will be covering the worst dungeon in every Zelda game. The picks will be based on which dungeons I had the worst experience with during my playthroughs, meaning my opinion may be different from yours. One thing you may be thinking is what actually counts as a dungeon? Well, I used multiple sources such as the Zelda wiki to figure out what actually counts as a dungeon. If this doesn't make sense right now, I promise it will shortly. Before we get started, there is something I need you to remember. Labeling something as the worst doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, which you'll see throughout the video. And for those wondering, no, both Four Swords games and Triforce Heroes are not included in this list, as they don't actually feature dungeons, instead having levels or stages. And if you don't believe me, look at the Zelda wiki, it says it right here. Without wasting any more time, let's find the worst dungeon in every Zelda game. Zelda 1's dungeon roster was actually pretty difficult to pick from, and that's not a good thing. To put it lightly, the original Legend of Zelda has a bad dungeon roster. Like, real bad. I don't really think any of the dungeons in this game are that good. Sure, it was the first ever Zelda game and helped pave the way for the future of the franchise, and I absolutely respect the game for that reason. Unfortunately, none of these labyrinths have aged very well at all. However, the reason this game was so difficult to pick from is because most dungeons are extremely similar. The most apparent ways of identifying each dungeon from one another come from either the enemy variety, boss fights, the layout, and of course, the color. Most of the actual puzzles in this game revolve around killing every enemy in a room, pushing a block, or bombing a random wall, which for someone who heavily values puzzles within dungeons such as myself is a big con. With all that said, which dungeon is the worst? Well, there are 9 dungeons in this game, and any of them would be a completely valid answer, but my real pick was between 2 options. Level 9 or Death Mountain is the hardest dungeon in this game by a long shot, with its many passageways and extremely difficult enemies, though this dungeon does have some redeeming qualities. It's the final dungeon in the game, so it's very impactful to the story, and has actually unique music compared to the others. However, my actual choice for this game is the puke-colored level 6, also called the Dragon. Besides being easily the least appealing dungeon from a visual standpoint, there was one reason why I chose this dungeon as the worst. I hate Wizrobes. And this dungeon has a lot of them. As someone who doesn't really like the difficulty of the early Zelda games, it should come as no surprise that I dislike the combat-focused level 6. Not only is this place crawling with many of my least favorite enemies in the entire game, but you have to fight arguably the hardest boss in the game halfway through. Gliok is a really cool boss, but is also really difficult if you aren't super used to the controls of the NES. Though the actual boss of this dungeon is Goma, which can literally be one-shot, leaving no fight at all. Apart from that, this dungeon is really the same as the others. I do like the magic rod as an item, but that's not enough to raise my opinion on this dungeon. Level 6 may be my personal least favorite dungeon in the first ever Zelda, but any of the 8 other options would be a good pick. Zelda 2 is hated by everyone and their grandma, but I for one think the hate has gotten out of hand. Zelda 2 has a great dungeon roster. I'm just kidding. It also sucks. I don't think it's even remotely a hot take to say that Zelda 2 has the worst dungeon roster in the entire franchise. This is a game that I don't think has a single redeeming quality with any of its dungeons. Well, besides the great music, but that's always a given. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link has a heavy focus on combat. So much so that there are almost no items or puzzles throughout the entire game, meaning that every temple is missing my favorite aspect of Zelda dungeons in general. Yay. I had mentioned how Death Mountain got a pass for being the worst dungeon in Zelda 1 since it was important to the story and unique enough for me not to choose. Well, the Great Palace in Zelda 2 is so bad that the impact doesn't even come close to saving it. The Great Palace is the final temple in Zelda 2, and boy was it a horrible way to go out. This huge and extremely confusing dungeon is packed to the brim with the toughest enemies in the entire game, and many tricks meant to purposefully screw the player over. I think the biggest flaw with this dungeon is just how big it is. I understand you want the final dungeon to stand out as the grand finale, but come on, this is just insane. The extreme difficulty of this game added on top of this super long dungeon is really not a good combination, as any death or game over can result in you restarting the descent from the beginning. Luckily, Nintendo was actually kind enough to give us some fairies to make it a bit easier, but it's really not enough. This on top of the many confusing hallways and random transparent walls or floors makes this easily one of the least enjoyable dungeons to explore. And that's not even mentioning the back-to-back boss fights at the end. The Thunderbird is also not a good boss, which is very fitting for this dungeon. Thankfully, once you beat the Thunderbird, it's basically over, as nearly everyone knows that Dark Link can be crouch stabbed to death with ease. For being arguably the hardest dungeon in the entire franchise, the frustrating Great Palace becomes extremely easy to hate. A while ago, I made a video comparing A Link to the Past to A Link Between Worlds. In that video, I shared my opinions on each game's dungeon roster. So you might already know that I don't exactly love the roster of dungeons in A Link to the Past. Sure, it was undeniably the biggest improvement from the previous games, but the overall inconsistency is enough to hold it back. I love a lot of the dungeons in this game, like the Swamp Palace, Dark Palace, Misery Mire, and Ice Palace, but I also hate a lot of the others, like the Desert Palace, Skull Woods, Turtle Rock, and the worst of the bunch, Gargoyle's Domain. I have many problems with this dungeon, but first, let's go over the positives. Having to escort the fake maiden out of the dungeon is really neat, and her being the dungeon boss was a great way to finish the temple. I also appreciate how consistent the shape of the dungeon is compared to the outside world, like how this floor of the dungeon can actually be seen from the overworld, which I think is quite interesting. Unfortunately, that's about everything Gargoyle's Domain has going for it. I had mentioned how the build up to the dungeon boss was neat, but unfortunately the boss itself is kinda lame. I really hate how a lot of the bosses in this game are just dodge the attack and hit the weak point with no special way to take it out. Blind is a cool idea with poor execution. The main 4 rooms of this dungeon can be hell to navigate through without a guide or previous knowledge, and I especially hate that this dungeon has the exact same visuals as the Dark Palace. One of the most important things A Link to the Past dungeon roster had introduced was the unique themed dungeons, rather than just being recolors like the previous games. Gargoyle's Domain being the only dungeon that looks similar to another really doesn't help its case. This is one of those dungeons that I really dread exploring on a replay. Though this might be the most influential group of dungeons in the entire franchise, it's also one of the more inconsistent ones, and Gargoyle's Domain is one of the biggest reasons why. Link's Awakening was the first Zelda game to have a truly great dungeon roster. Unlike the previous 3, I don't think Link's Awakening features a bad dungeon throughout the entire game. Sure, some are definitely better than others, but there's not one temple that I truly dislike. Of course, this is not what I like to hear when I'm making a video on the worst dungeons, as it makes it so difficult to pick my least favorite. When researching for this video, I had realized that technically there are more dungeons in this game than I had initially thought. As I stated at the start of the video, many Zelda wikis have certain temples listed as dungeons when I personally would disagree. One of those being the Windfish Egg. How this is a dungeon is truly beyond me. It's literally just the same room repeated over and over again and has no puzzles besides walking the correct path. If we're counting the Windfish Egg as a dungeon, then it is by far the worst in the entire game. But I don't really agree with it being a dungeon, which is why I instead picked Key Cavern. Honestly, this dungeon isn't even remotely bad. It just has a few more things that I dislike about it compared to the others. The first being that god-awful background track. In my worst Zelda songs video, I had mentioned how horrible this dungeon theme is, and I will stand by that. While it was fixed in the Switch port, the original Game Boy version of this song is extremely irritating, and not something you want to hear when trying to use your brain. Aside from that, Key Cavern has another overwhelming annoyance. Keys. As the name suggests, this cavern has a lot of keys in it, which has always been a controversial topic in the Zelda community, as too many keys in a dungeon can require a lot of backtracking if one is missed. Backtracking is definitely the biggest issue with this dungeon. On top of the keys, these crystal switches are also quite prominent throughout the dungeon, as they need to be the right color if you want to progress, which means there's a lot of back and forth if you don't have the right color selected. The dungeon item is the Pegasus Boots, which is genuinely such a fun item and has a lot of super fun uses in this dungeon as well. The boss is also pretty good, making more clever uses for the boots. Again, this dungeon is actually okay. It just has a few things that make me dislike it more than the others from the same game. Unfortunately, there are a lot of games with extremely solid dungeon rosters in this franchise, which makes my job here a lot harder, and Ocarina of Time is another prime example of that. The first ever 3D game in the Legend of Zelda franchise really kicked off this new era with a bang. Ocarina of Time is arguably the best Zelda game ever. Its influence on the series as a whole and for the most part timeless gameplay combined for my personal favorite game of all time. A large reason why so many people love Ocarina of Time is the near perfect dungeon roster. This game features some of my favorite dungeons in this series, like the Forest, Shadow, and Spirit temples, and so many other iconic temples on top of that. Normally, this stacked roster would screw me over, but there has always been one dungeon in Ocarina of Time that I really dislike. My hatred for Jabu Jabu's belly started when I was a child. Like many others, Jabu Jabu was a serious obstacle for my younger self. The escort mission was so tedious and Ruto's bratty attitude didn't help it. Though this dungeon has gotten significantly easier as the years go by, it's still not a good dungeon. The most apparent issue with this dungeon is the disgusting atmosphere. Honestly, this is like half the reason why I hate it so much. Going from exploring inside a great tree and a volcanic cave to a f***ing fish stomach is kinda unreal. While it may be extremely fitting, the visual design is still gross. The stomach noises in the background are like the perfect cherry on top of this revolting tunnel. The noises along with the random dangly things on the roof make this one of the least enjoyable dungeons to explore. Speaking of exploring this dungeon, you must do so alongside Ruto. As previously mentioned, this can be really tedious, as carrying her above your head limits how much you can attack. She also doesn't move with Link, meaning you must go back and pick her up every time you put her down. Fortunately, this becomes much less irritating with lots of practice, but it doesn't make it much better. Both the boomerang and Baronade are the clear high points of this dungeon. Unfortunately, they're not enough to save it. I really hate Jabu Jabu, and I know many others do as well. This dungeon is both irritating and gross. Thankfully, the dungeons after are much better. Out of every game in the franchise, Majora's Mask has the smallest dungeon roster, featuring only 4 main dungeons throughout the course of the game. Overall, the quality of these 4 dungeons is pretty mixed. Stone Tower Temple is an amazing final challenge and one of the greatest dungeons of all time. Woodfall Temple is considered to be one of the best starter dungeons, introducing the player to the game while not feeling like a tutorial. My pick for the worst dungeon in Majora's Mask is definitely between either Snowhead or Great Bay Temple. Snowhead has a really irritating progression system that can require a lot of backtracking if not done correctly, using a large pillar in the center of the dungeon as an obstacle, requiring Link to slowly break it down. While this dungeon is quite annoying, the worst dungeon in Majora's Mask will always be the Great Bay Temple. For some reason, there are a ton of people who genuinely love this dungeon, which is something I've never understood. Now, I will admit, I have been a bit too harsh on this dungeon in the past, labeling it as one of the worst dungeons in the series, but I still don't think it's good. This dungeon features a lot of swimming, which isn't my favorite mechanic in the slightest. I've always found the portions where Link was forced underwater to be quite irritating. The main idea behind this dungeon is actually pretty neat, using many switch-like machines to control the flow of water. Unfortunately, actually playing through this temple isn't very fun. I've always found Great Bay to be way too open, not really giving you a clear path forward, which can be awesome if done correctly, but this dungeon just makes my head hurt. The clever use of ice arrows is definitely a positive, using the magic to create platforms to aid Link with certain puzzles. By far my biggest issue with this dungeon is the awful boss fight against Georg. In my 3D boss ranking, I had gone into great detail on why I heavily dislike this boss, so I'll spare the heavy details in case you want to check that video out for yourself, which you totally should, by the way. It's great. But this boss fight is easily one of my least favorites ever. The extremely boring first half and irritating underwater second half come together to create an awful boss. While I don't hate it as much as I used to, the Great Bay Temple still has many notable flaws, and don't even get me started on the 3DS remake. Oracle of Seasons was quite a difficult game to pick the worst dungeon for. The reason for that being how forgettable this dungeon roster really is. I had played Oracle of Seasons only a few months ago and had already forgotten like half of this game's dungeon roster. Unfortunately, the only one I really remembered was the Gnarled Root dungeon, and for all the wrong reasons. First of all, that name is so stupid. I don't know why, but I really dislike the name Gnarled Root dungeon. Anyway, this dungeon is extremely boring. Obviously, being the first dungeon means it's not going gonna have nearly as much sauce as the others do. While other starter dungeons have at least some sauce, the Gnarled Root dungeon has none, lacking an even remotely interesting atmosphere along with its extremely mediocre background track. This dungeon is also incredibly easy, which again makes sense, but it doesn't make me dislike it any less. The dungeon item is the Seed Satchel, which is actually a pretty neat item in general, as it's used many times throughout the game. Unfortunately, the uses in this dungeon are super straightforward and lame. The boss fight is probably the highlight of this dungeon, being a throwback to Zelda 1 with the boss Aquamentus, which is a cool boss, but like the rest of the dungeon, nothing special at all. Again, this roster is extremely forgettable, and most of it is more mediocre than it is bad. Still, Gnarled Root Dungeon stuck with me all this time thanks to its very boring and bland design. Unlike its twin, Oracle of Ages does have a clear worse dungeon. While the overall dungeon roster is quite similar to Seasons, since most of them are quite forgettable, there is one dungeon in this game that many people, myself included, loathe. Oracle of Ages gives us the highly anticipated return to our favorite fishy friend, Jabu Jabu. Somehow, Nintendo saw how many people disliked Ocarina of Time, Jabu Jabu's belly, and went, yeah, let's do that again. But this time, it's in 2D, which honestly makes it so much worse. Despite sharing a name with the Child Era dungeon, Jabu Jabu's belly is really more similar to the Water Temple. The big idea behind this dungeon is to use these pressure plates to change the water level for each floor. This idea is a great concept, but requires so much backtracking it's not even funny. The overall layout of this dungeon is extremely messy and not easy to navigate through. There is a lot of diving in and out of deep water in this dungeon to get from one area to the next. And speaking of diving, the swimming controls in this game are also awful. For some reason, when Link acquires the mermaid suit, the swimming controls change completely, requiring the player to continuously spam the D-pad in the wanted direction. These new controls get old super fast in a dungeon that is so heavily focused on swimming. I had mentioned how much backtracking is required for this dungeon, and that's all thanks to the very high key count. Making your way through this confusing fish only to find out that you're missing a key is such an awful feeling and will immediately wipe the smile off your face. That is, if you even had one in the first place. The upgraded switch hook is also such a lame item. While the switch hook in general is a really great item, its upgraded form doesn't feel much different at all. The uses in Jabu Jabu's belly compared to the Skull dungeon is like night and day. There were hardly any fun puzzles with this item at all, which is a real shame since again, I love this item. Thankfully, after all the time you've spent in this hellhole of a dungeon, Nintendo actually decides to reward the player with this super easy and really underwhelming dungeon boss. For a dungeon as hard as Jabu Jabu, you'd think the boss fight would actually be quite the challenge, right? Well, this boss is by far the easiest part of this entire dungeon. Using the switch hook to damage this boss with his own magic is not hard in the slightest and is over in like 40 seconds. Everything about this dungeon is just so messy and tedious. I don't understand how you could actually enjoy this dungeon at all. Everyone, a quick round of applause for Jabu Jabu for being the only dungeon to appear twice on this list. Congratulations. Wind Waker has one of the most interesting groups of dungeons on this list. The community is quite split on if this dungeon roster is good or underwhelming. While I definitely think Wind Waker has some great dungeons, I would fall more on the side of calling this roster underwhelming, mainly for the quantity of dungeons. Wind Waker features 7 dungeons, which might seem like a pretty normal amount, and it is, but some of the dungeons are really not that great. I've always been a big fan of both the Earth and Wind Temple, and the Tower of the Gods is my personal favorite dungeon in the game, meaning I have 4 options to choose from, but come on, we all know what it is. I know I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but my least favorite dungeon in Wind Waker is the Forsaken Fortress, and it's not particularly close. Unlike the other dungeons in this game, the Forsaken Fortress doesn't have any redeeming qualities about it. Let's start with the most positive things about this dungeon. The second visit to this dungeon is actually pretty fun, featuring a cool item in the Skull Hammer and a fun boss and mini-boss fights with the Helmrock King and Phantom Ganon. Unfortunately, I don't really count this towards the dungeon, since the second visit is quite literally just the action, meaning there are no puzzles or exploration. Which brings me to one of my least favorite things about this dungeon. There are almost no puzzles at all. A majority of the obstacles in this dungeon revolve around sneaking past guards to make it around the fortress, as Link loses his sword at the very start of the dungeon, forcing him to rely on his stealth. And stealth is something I am not a fan of at all, no matter the game. The only puzzle I can genuinely remember from this dungeon is when you sneak out of the jail cell. The rest revolve around waiting for certain enemies or searchlights to pass. I feel like this dungeon would have benefited from being placed in the middle of the game rather than the very start. Aside from Outset Island, this is the second location you'll visit during the game, which makes a ton of sense narrative-wise, but doesn't make for a good first impression. The atmosphere of the Forsaken Fortress is also nothing special. While the grey stone walls are very fitting, it's quite bland at the same time, and the repetitive marching music in the background makes this dungeon even more tedious. While none of the points I made are even remotely shocking to any returning viewer, my point still stands. The Forsaken Fortress is easily the worst dungeon in Wind Waker, and one I have really never understood the love for. Minish Cap deserves more love. Sure, recently this game has been receiving a lot more praise than usual, but I still think it's a bit underrated. This game is really great, and a large reason for that is the really solid dungeon roster, which of course is not what I like to see. Minish Cap is another game that doesn't exactly have a clear worst dungeon, which is quite impressive considering the options are pretty limited, though there has always been one that doesn't quite stand out like the others. The Fortress of Wind isn't a bad dungeon by any means, it's just kinda mediocre. The first thing that stood out to me with this dungeon is how unfitting the name is. What the hell does this have to do with wind? I mean, yeah, this temple is connected to those wind tribe dudes, but the actual dungeon doesn't have anything that screams wind. Which brings me to my first point. The atmosphere is honestly just really bland. Both the music and visuals aren't anything unique or special. I honestly think I'm leaning more to the ugly side of this dungeon's atmosphere, especially with all this cheese lying around. The moments are actually a pretty fun dungeon item. Digging through the dirt can be quite satisfying, especially in the great boss fight. I guess the enemy variety is kinda annoying as well, but it's not enough to be a serious issue. Honestly, not much else I can even say about this dungeon. The Fortress of Wind is by no means bad, but definitely not as great as the others. A perfectly mediocre dungeon. Twilight Princess is one of two games often brought up during the discussion for which has the best dungeons, and for good reason. This roster is absolutely legendary, featuring some of my favorite dungeons ever in the Arbiter's Grounds and Snow Peak Ruins. Unfortunately, this game also has its fair share of mediocre temples in the mix. Like the Minish Cap, I don't think Twilight Princess has a bad dungeon, just some that are better than others. There were a few dungeons I had considered for this list. The first is the Lakebed Temple, which I've actually grown to love a lot more recently with its eerie atmosphere. The dungeon I was certain would be the worst was the Goron Mines, having a lot of waiting around and slow walking with its magnetic floors. That was before I had remembered the Palace of Twilight exists. Like I said in my 3D dungeon ranking, the Palace of Twilight is the definition of mid. It really has a lot of great things going for it, but an equal amount of negatives alongside them. One of the best aspects about this dungeon is the unique atmosphere. Of course, this dungeon takes place in the Twilight Realm. The pink sky and dark clouds makes for such a visually appealing place to explore. The Zant fight at the end of the dungeon is the other high point. This boss fight is one of the best in the franchise, and it fits Zant's character extremely well. Most of the puzzles require Link to carry these balls through the dungeon while avoiding the looming Zant hands, which was not executed very well at all. The Zant hands provide almost no threat since you can bat them away with your hookshot pretty easily. This idea could have been cool if it was slightly more challenging. Throughout the dungeon, Link must also fight Phantom Zant multiple times, which is also not an interesting mini-boss, and the fact you have to fight it multiple times doesn't make it much better. The dungeon definitely picks up after the Master Sword is fully powered up, but at that point the dungeon is almost over. The Palace of Twilight had a lot of potential, but ultimately fell flat in the actual execution. Again, not a bad dungeon, just very mediocre. Until now, we've seen a very diverse assortment of dungeons. Some are mediocre and others are bad, but we haven't seen any dungeons that I absolutely despise. Well, until now. There is not a single dungeon in this entire franchise that I dislike more than my next pick. This dungeon combines repetition with a bad atmosphere, music, enemies, irritating puzzles, and literally every negative thing ever. Unlike all the previous dungeons I've mentioned, this dungeon has absolutely no redeeming qualities at all, making it by far the worst Zelda dungeon of all time. I'm talking, of course, about Phantom Hourglass's very own, the awful Temple of the Ocean King. As I've just mentioned, this dungeon has zero redeeming qualities, and I genuinely mean that. Let's start with the glaring flaw. This entire dungeon is timed, meaning you only have about 10 to 20 minutes to reach the bottom goal. I absolutely hate anything that involves a timer, and the added pressure feels so unnecessary. Technically, it makes sense since you're using the Phantom Hourglass, but it's still a stupid mechanic. There are many floors in this dungeon, and a lot of them are based around stealth. I had already mentioned how much I dislike sneaking in video games, and this dungeon is a prime example of why. Avoiding the phantoms while trying to find a key or these triangle things is so tedious and also extremely stressful with the added timer. While you're doing all this, the most irritating piece of music is playing in your ears. Dare I say this song is extremely fitting, since the dungeon is also just as annoying as the song is. The atmosphere in general is so boring. I don't really like the visual design of this dungeon very much at all. It's not horrible, but it's not very unique in the slightest. You might be thinking, boy does this sound bad, but it doesn't sound that bad, and you're right. At least you only have to do this dungeon once and it's over. If only. My biggest issue with this dungeon by far is how you have to visit it 6 fucking times. In what universe did Nintendo think this was okay? Technically, you're only actually forced to visit this dungeon, I think, 4 times, but the average player will return to this dungeon 5 to 6 times. Every time you return, Link's new items will help him to explore the dungeon quicker, which was a good decision, but it really doesn't make this dungeon any less annoying. Repeating the same puzzles over and over again is so unbelievably mind-numbing. Luckily, there are checkpoints at certain parts of the dungeon, and your hourglass can hold more sand in it, which means more time, which is great, but it still sucks. Temple of the Ocean King completely kills the pacing of this game, as you have to visit it after every dungeon. I have no urge to even consider replaying this game solely because of how horrible this dungeon is. Undeniably my least favorite dungeon in the history of The Legend of Zelda, and I know many others will agree with me. Thankfully, Spirit Tracks doesn't have any dungeons that are quite as bad. I actually think Spirit Tracks has a pretty solid overall dungeon roster. I had quite a hard time picking the worst dungeon from this game, as honestly not that many of them stand out as bad. I think the weakest of the group is the game's first dungeon, the Forest Temple. Of course, this is by far the easiest dungeon in the entire game, which does make sense as it's also the first. There was one big issue I have with the Forest Temple that made it stand out above the others. The dungeon item blows. Get it? The Whirlwind is one of the most irritating Zelda items to use. Both DS games are pretty notorious for their terrible controls, and this item is a perfect display of said jank. Every time you want to use this item, you have to manually blow into your DS. I have no clue why Nintendo didn't make this a toggle option in the menu somewhere, so you can choose to have mic or tap controls. You know what I mean? Having to blow in your DS is such an irritating mechanic. From this item to the Spirit Flute, it wasn't used well once. The dungeon boss is just okay, and the puzzles mainly involve the previously mentioned Whirlwind, which isn't a good thing. The atmosphere of this dungeon is also quite bland, but the music, while not incredible, is a definite step up from Phantom Hourglass in its irritating dungeon theme. The Forest Temple is not a bad dungeon by any means. I honestly think I could have gone a few different ways for this game's worst dungeon, but the physically demanding use of the Whirlwind was enough to make it stand out as my least favorite. A while back, I had mentioned how Twilight Princess was one of 2 games most frequently brought up during the discussion for which game has the best dungeon roster, the other game being Skyward Sword. I have always been a firm believer that Skyward Sword has the best dungeon roster of all time, as it features 3 of my favorite dungeons ever in the Lanayru Mining Facility, Ancient Cistern, and the Sand Ship. There were 2 dungeons I was juggling back and forth for which is the worst. The Fire Sanctuary is a good dungeon, but extremely underwhelming since it comes right after the Ancient Cistern and Sand Ship. I instead chose the game's first dungeon, Skyview Temple, as the game's worst. This is a prime example of worst not meaning bad, as Skyview Temple is one of the best starter dungeons in the entire franchise. I believe this dungeon's biggest flaw has to do with its atmosphere. Skyward Sword is another game that excels in great atmosphere and music in its dungeons, meaning anything below great is gonna feel underwhelming. The music in Skyview Temple is really quite bland, and I feel like the atmosphere, while still being good, is definitely the least interesting of the bunch. I really like the Girahim boss fight at the end of the dungeon, which I had talked about more in my 3D boss ranking. The beetle is also a great item that makes clever use of the Wii's motion controls, which is an area of the game I've always loved. This dungeon definitely can feel like a tutorial, but it also adds some difficult challenges in the mix, creating a great starter dungeon, but just a good dungeon overall. Again, this could have gone to the Fire Sanctuary depending on the mood, but both dungeons are still really good. The Skyview Temple is the worst dungeon in the absolutely stacked roster of Skyward Sword. If you've been following my channel for longer than a day, it should come as no surprise when I say that I absolutely love A Link Between Worlds. Of course, that means this is yet another game without a truly bad dungeon. I had just mentioned how Skyward Sword had the best dungeon roster in the entire franchise, and I stick by that, but I think A Link Between Worlds roster is more consistent, if that makes sense. I think every single dungeon in this game is good. There was really only one true option for the worst dungeon in A Link Between Worlds. Well, it might be the boring pick. The Eastern Palace is the simplest and least interesting dungeon in the game, which makes total sense as this temple is also the starter dungeon for its respective game. I hate using similar reasoning for multiple dungeons as to why they're the worst, but I really have no choice. Every other dungeon in this game has such interesting puzzles, music, and atmosphere. The 3 pre-Master Sword dungeons are all quite great despite them all being pretty simple. The Eastern Palace does a great job at introducing the most important aspects of the game, like using items, solving puzzles, and merging into the wall. This dungeon is quite similar to its older counterpart in A Link to the Past, as it's literally the same location. Most of the puzzles in this dungeon revolve around hitting a switch with your bow or activating a pressure plate to continue exploring, which makes this dungeon extremely easy. The Yuka boss fight at the end is pretty cool, as you fight the main antagonist right off the rip, just like in Skyward Sword, though again, it's super easy. There really weren't any other options for the worst dungeon in A Link Between Worlds, which is why the Eastern Palace gets the unfortunate role of being the worst in this extremely consistent roster. Breath of the Wild was the first Zelda game to feature a truly unique roster of dungeons. The dungeons of this game are so different that some would even hesitate to call them dungeons in the first place. Excluding DLC, there are 5 dungeons in Breath of the Wild, those being all 4 Divine Beasts and the epic Hyrule Castle. Obviously, my choice for this game is going to be one of the 4 Divine Beasts, as Hyrule Castle is way too interesting to be picked for this list. To be honest, this is yet another game that you could really have any of the options here be a valid pick, as most of the Divine Beasts are relatively on the same tier, though there has always been one that I've always found the least intriguing. Divine Beast Varudania has always been my least favorite of the bunch. Again, most of these dungeons are relatively on the same tier, since a lot of them are really not all that different. The main things distinguishing these 4 are the visual design and control feature. Every Divine Beast features the ability to move an area of the machine. Varudania is able to climb on the side of the volcano, tipping the entire dungeon 90 degrees. While the idea is really cool, I prefer some of the other Divine Beast controls like the Trunk of Ruda or the rotating insides of Naboris. The overall atmosphere of this dungeon is also by far the worst. Being inside a volcano is a lot less interesting than a desert, reservoir, or sky. The main reason why I put Varudania as the worst is the boss fight. Just like the Divine Beasts themselves, the Blight Ganon fights are all on the same tier, though I do think Fireblight is easily the least interesting of the bunch. The dungeon actually starts out great, requiring the player to navigate through the dark hallways of the mech. It's a shame the rest of the dungeon doesn't live up to its unique introduction. Again, this really could have gone to any of the 4 Divine Beasts, but Varudania has always stood out as the most forgettable of the bunch. Tears of the Kingdom took a huge leap in the right direction following the lackluster dungeons of its predecessor. Though the dungeons were a clear improvement, many players still found themselves disliking many of the game's temples. I for one think Tears of the Kingdom has a really mixed dungeon roster. You've got your great dungeons like the Wind or Thunder Temple and some mediocre dungeons like the Fire and Spirit Temple. Oh, and then there's that. The Water Temple is pretty easily the worst actual dungeon in Tears of the Kingdom. I do say actual dungeon since a lot of people say that Gloom's Approach is somehow a dungeon, which makes no sense whatsoever since it doesn't have its own map or puzzles, so I won't be picking it because I don't really think it's a dungeon at all. I had put the Water Temple at the very bottom of my 3D dungeon ranking, so many of you who've already seen that video shouldn't be too surprised with its appearance on this list. I'm gonna be honest, I said some pretty harsh things about this dungeon in that video, and I don't think it deserved a lot of the hate that I gave it. It's undeniably a mediocre to bad dungeon, but I don't really despise anything about it. If there was one word I could use to describe this dungeon, it would be empty. I feel almost nothing when thinking about this dungeon. No anger or happiness, just empty. The one thing the Water Temple does very well is the atmosphere, which I'm now noticing is a recurring theme for many dungeons in this video. While not being fitting in the slightest, a gorgeous Zora temple located thousands of feet in the air makes for such a beautiful place to explore. This dungeon also uses zero gravity, which is a super neat feature and definitely one of the high points of this dungeon. Unfortunately, that's about all this temple has going for it. To go perfectly with the beautiful Zora architecture, Nintendo decided to add shit everywhere in this temple, which narratively makes sense stands, but otherwise is just plain gross. None of the puzzles in this dungeon are very memorable either, no thanks to Sidon's terrible ability. He has by far the lamest ability of the sages, which is a huge shame as he's also my favorite character of the bunch. I didn't use his ability once outside of this dungeon, and I know it can actually be quite strong, but I found it to be more of an inconvenience trying to activate it. And on top of all these cons, we have the horrible dungeon boss, Muktorok. This boss is so incredibly irritating, requiring Link to clear the arena of sludge in order to chase after the Octo, which is super annoying and an awful way to end an already underwhelming dungeon. While Tears of the Kingdom was definitely a step in the right direction, I hope Nintendo can improve on this underwhelming roster, as it's overall very inconsistent and features my least favorite 3D Zelda dungeon ever. Despite Echoes of Wisdom having overall a really solid dungeon roster, most of the dungeons were quite forgettable. Of course, this makes picking the worst of the bunch quite difficult, since I feel more or less the same about most of these dungeons. Most of the dungeons in this game could make valid picks to be the worst, but since none stood out as bad, I'll be picking the dungeon that I remember enjoying the least. The Elden Temple was the final dungeon I had completed in this game, and of the bunch, it was probably my least favorite. First of all, the atmosphere is really quite bland. I know I've said this many times already, but fire-themed dungeons are not my favorite visually. Of the main recurring dungeon themes, I think it is by far the most boring, and the Elden Temple is no exception. My biggest grudge against this dungeon is how forgettable it was. I have at least one very positive thing to say about every other dungeon in the game, but I find myself drawing blanks when thinking about the Elden Temple. Echoes of Wisdom focuses a lot on puzzles over other primary gameplay features. Unfortunately, the Elden Temple features some really weak puzzles compared to the others. Other dungeons like the Lanayru Temple made clever use of elemental echoes to progress through. The Elden Temple progression relies heavily on platforming through the lava with certain echoes, which wasn't really my favorite, as I had a horrible experience with that damn final room. Hate that room. Volvagia is a really cool idea for a boss, but wasn't nearly as good as the original. Overall, just a very okay dungeon and the weakest in an interesting roster. That does it for the video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. With a topic as diverse as Zelda dungeons, there are bound to be a few disagreements. If your least favorite dungeons were not included, feel free to leave a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe for more Zelda content just like this. When you subscribe, turn on post notifications so you don't miss an upload or stream. Thanks again for your time, it means a lot. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.